And moving right along in the ever-present origin with Gene Gebser, he really sets the stage for how these conscious structures really lay out beyond the introduction that we went over to the comparison between the unperspectival world, the perspectival world, and the development of the aperspectival world. And so he's going to do this in chapter 2 with the three European worlds. And so through this, he's setting the groundwork for these structures themselves by drawing through these changes really in art history, in particular with the Renaissance period, where for Gebser, space is really experienced for the first time, and therefore the ego, which of course is key to really seeing the mutations of these really changes of these structures, you see where you have the difference between the binding of the group and the collective we as a tribe that's actually experienced in a sort of differentiation between the individual ego, the will, if you would like, as compared to the will of the rest of the tribe. And so this unperspectival world and its conditions is the human history of space until the Renaissance, which of course wasn't articulated as such. And so when space is discovered and experienced as a sort of novelty, this is the really way how you see it go from the undifferentiated, where the ego isn't necessarily at a sort of confrontation, or at least at a disjunction really with its own background, with what the subject is integrated into space. And so space was always tribal and never differentiated in the unperspectival world, is essentially what Gebser is getting at. And really this unperspectival world, at least in the timelines, Gebser of course was never big on dates by any stretch. This is to say really along his magical and mythical constructions as the way the unperspectival world was. And so Gebser really brings in the art history here, where if you compare the Giotto paintings going from that sort of Byzantine background of the gold background where the subject is in it, where you have no real difference between the background and the actual perspectivity of the sky. And this is introduced here where you're seeing this sort of experience of open space itself, the Faustian really driver, if you'd like. And so this move to open space, when you have events such as Petrarch going up Mount Ventoux in 1336, where ascending the top of the mountain and the writing of the closeness to the divine experience as moving away from the cavern background to the sky, such as contemporary art at the time really ascends and experiences space for the first time in cultural history. You can think of things like Zarathustra, for example, this sort of Faustian, well, one of the real characteristics, I would say, of the West, of course, is clearly mountain climbing and its activity and popularity, certainly. And this, of course, is a rather unique thing that a lot of people would overlook, actually. And so, continuing though, for Gebser, this is really the birth of that Faustian experience of space as demonstrated. And so he turns to Copernicus in 1543, where there's sort of a midway of still being trapped in the circular world with the heliocentric model of the perfect circular planetary motion, or world of the night sky, and unleashes Earth revolving around the sun, and This is really the movement away from caverns. You have Columbus, where he leaves the serpent ocean and bound to the world and experiences of, the new world. And so Earth and space is demonstrated, and then furthermore with the opening of bodies, again with space, with William Harvey and blood circulation and its discoveries. And then of course you have Michelangelo creates the ellipses. But so Gebser, as we talked about in the introduction, he thinks that all of these events, these new findings along his model is really instrumental to seeing how, one's placement in time and history, all of the art, philosophy, culture, these things are all interwoven, of course, within a people. And I think that's a really refreshing way that is really lost, certainly today. But one of my favorite things that he points out, myself personally, is when he talks about the seventh planetary spheres to the eighth with the Renaissance. And so this elevation of perspective as the eighth art, you can see as so if you know anything about Gebser's biography, you know that he moved to Spain briefly and managed to learn the language rather quickly. He was renowned for being able to understand not just high European culture but also languages. And one of his more interesting insights, I think, that he has to offer in this book is how language changed from this opposition formed between night and eight. So in English, of course, this is dropping the N consonant, and this can be tracked through German with Nacht and Oct. And so if you're dropping the N through these Western languages, has this negation of night and eight. And so this is symbolic of the opening of the discovery of space and the end of that cavern mentality. The perspectival world of space is one of visuals, and the unperspectival is more, of course, with myth and the association of mouth. It's auditory. And he has these interesting insights into different bodies, well, not just bodies, but the body parts themselves, and their sort of importance and meaning to that particular structure. And so the ear is a sort of acoustic cavern, of course, with the sort of 360 way it's perceived. And so in perspective, everything, however, is pictorial in space now instead of objects creating their own space. And so this then could shift to the discovery of the ego that confronts the world in the deficient mode of the perspective and the hyper extent of the eye, to the point he is atomized and cut off from the rest of the world. And for Gebser, this is a really important insight, because there's going to be many deficient attempts since then that, want to reinvigorate the sort of return, if you'd like, to that tribal, the more mythical and structure through, of course, 20th century mass ideologies. And so this is, for Gebser, the deficient modality of the perspectival world, because, of course, it's overstayed its welcome, really. And so the perspectival is one of carving a single point of view. As such, with perspectival art is one moment or one part of space. And so carving up of that sort of motion, if you'd like, in a sort of comic strip way, and reduces the art, if you'd like, to this single point of view and a perspectival view of art of one moment and one part of space being experienced. Where, of course, if we jump to the aperspectival, is one of a profile of just one single individual experiencing it. And this is demonstrated, of course, with Picasso, where you get multiple angles in that profile from differing angles, where Renaissance art is frozen and sliced in that sort of strip way of a single painting, whereas modernity is put together in a sort of simultaneous way of space and time both being present. And so this obsession with the concretion of time, as time is now put into the work of art in a concrete and present way. So essentially we're seeing as perspectivity dissolves away for a perspectivity, we're going from experiencing space to experiencing space and time, and really looking back at these old models in a way that is more aperspectival. And so everything in the aperspectival world in modern art is about putting back together that perspectivity with the concretion of time as its primary inflection. Whereas in the perspectival world, it was, of course, space as its primary, as I just explained. And so you really have this lineage here of a new anxiety about time integrated with space. And so in the aperspectival model, he sees that as the sort of fourth dimension. And so in the 19th century, he points to such as Einstein with time and space as a fourth dimension, where each object has its own space and time. And so music, philosophy, science is really in an obsession of the concretion, time, and presentation of time. And so this is essentially going back again to those pre-models of perspectivity that, was pulled apart at the deficiency, if you'd like, of what space was experienced, and then reintegrated again with this new idea of time and space. And so Gebser essentially is saying that he sees modern art as a grand revelation of a new structure, internally consistent, and really a break of history of West. And he sees this as a sort of affirmation, as opposed to his earlier predecessors, if you'd like, such as Spengler, would have scoffed at it. But of course, ironically, and I think this is a sort of side note here, we would look, of course, to the postmodern such as Jean Baudrillard before on the channel, who of course was really into such things like cinema and pop culture. Of course, Gebser has no interest at all with pop culture. He scoffs at the idea of it and really denigrates it. Now, this isn't to say that modern art compared to pop culture may have some differences in quality, perhaps. I'm not arguing that. I am simply saying, though, that Gebser, perhaps in that same fashion that he tries to retain modernity, could be critiqued with how he saw, modern culture as it was evolving in his own time. But now, digressing to chapter 3, which is really him getting to the mutations themselves and the consciousness in their nature. These mutations, rather than, we talk about a lot with the Anglo perspective of change in the Darwinian, this gradual change and culmination. Gebser, of course, is in that German tradition, German thought of catastrophe, chaos, if you'd like, which I think is really an extension of the Continentals by and large, as compared to the Anglo tradition. And so there's discontinuities, there's no real linear way that we could say these structures evolve. We don't have a causal principle, of course, and we certainly do not see these perspectives or even the structures themselves as a sort of gradual mutation where we are standing atop of all of history. Gebser has no interest in that. And so the sudden novelty in each structure has certain aspects catered to them in their strengths and weaknesses. As such, with the gradual loss in spirituality, or for Gebser, he takes telepathy very seriously, and the ontology of the spirit world, as a matter of fact. And so he's saying that as the ego has calcified, we have lost our ability to have telepathy, our ability to even understand something like it, because we can only see it really through the individual ego, post mental conscious structure, if you'd like. And so, these other ways, these myths, these magical ways prior are now lost to us. It's very similar to how Heidegger would see truth I associated with before. But nonetheless, there is somewhat of a structure to be had with regards to the sleep cycle of clarity. Again, he does see, though, that the ego is, moving along in this waking consciousness, though, nonetheless, where he borrows from the Upanishads, where you go from the dreamless to the dreaming to the waking. And just to add as an aside, Gebser somewhat looks down on Hindu and Buddhism as a reversion back down, turning away from the real world, if you'd like, to nirvana. And so he really sees as a sort of deficiency of turning away from the world itself. I'm not sure I totally agree with that, but nonetheless, though, you can see, much like with Spengler, though, the civilizations are somewhat of a milieu-like feature that rises up, withers, and dies. Description, I think, of the lotus, if you'd like, is much more with what Gebser would see of history, I think, than perhaps the Anglo tradition would have us believe. Now, I want to reintroduce really these structures in a more in-depth way, starting with the archaic, which is the silence from which the other three come and go. So Gebser, interesting enough, says that the structure of this, and this is what I really meant when I talked about the association of Baudrillard with seduction and the archaic structure, because this sort of seamless unity where there was silence and nothing opposing the human condition and nature. There's no awakened soul, there's no micro or macro, there's no tension really between the two, and so there's no rationality or even human separateness from nature itself. And so this is the identical to the world as a sort of cosmic egg, or how that primordial atom, if you'd like, or even womb of perfection, where everything ultimately is ever present, I think, is really what he's actually saying. The archaic structure in its silence, if you'd like, in a metaphorical way, is what really drives and is really the origin of all of the other conscious structures. And so the archaic structure, again, I would associate with the ever-present, or the organic being, that any mutations are prohibited to happen. And of course, there's no real reason or rationality, no mental way of understanding that. Gebser highlights that these structures can become deficient and overarch their meanings and become petrified. So, if we were looking at some of the, straggler world tribal societies that are left, these are ultimately deficient modes that have become more cliche over time, that of course were once novelties. You could think of how Spengler sees a lot of the Eastern world now, where they're attempting to just westernize themselves just to simply compete with the empire, and there's nothing really to add, or no new novelties to really be had with these petrified cultures. It just kind of becomes this sort of kitsch, recycled, and just really taken from its sort of cultural energy. But Gebser is open to believe that within his models, and this is definitely from the archaic to the magical, it could have been more gradual, but he doesn't really find himself, at least he doesn't see really the evidence that, over time, just one day, the magical just simply happened and just came into being. But it's actually his strongest case for it, simply because he never really sees anywhere in history where there's no reason to believe that suddenly this then shifted into it. it seems more into like you kind of have this new revelation and things really get going within that new novelty, if you'd like. But shifting to the magical structure, you have, of course, no real start date, but hundreds of thousands of years with primitive man in the cave. And so you think of the Paleolithic hunter gathering and the ways in which the magical rituals, who really seized the point unity, each with their own axiom of dimensions. And so the magic is the one dimension and ascends to the fourth dimension of consciousness in the integral. And so, that process going, multilateral in dimensions over time to the Perspectival, when you took to culture as magic, as it develops as an immune of dealing with nature in the outer world, which is filled with threats. And so the spells are, of course, meant to prohibit and defer and manipulate the threats of nature. So you're starting to see the divorcing of that seamless way the archaic was to now the magical, where spell casting is used to manipulate this sort of ionic chaos, if you'd like to use the lose. And so tribal societies draw the image and throw the spear at the image and return with the actualized hunt itself. So you try to recreate, manipulate the way in which the ritual was done and actually have it actualized manipulated to make happen. And so you have a sympathy for the events as they happen. Everything is penetrated in the magical structure or related. And so everything in the magical world goes from the archaic whole to the part of a whole and creates effects and sympathies to the part into the greater whole. Again, thinking of the spell casting and how you're trying to now manipulate certain properties of events. And you really have that sort of divorcing then from that archaic primordial. And so turning to art in the magical structure is the mouth with no mouth. It is the nonverbal communication, such as telepathy, clairvoyance, nonverbal forms of communication to the magical structure. Interesting for Gebser, he actually sees myth as a sort of deficiency. And so the mouthless example is one where the ancestor worships of these magical societies is one in which we do not change. And so the divinely inspired world created for us in the mouth. And so technologies is to be repressed from them. So you could think of how, these tribal societies perhaps resisted something like modernity or the creation of it, because of course, if the divine created this world, it is to be respected, then why would we change it? And so the magical structure then has a fixation of the ear, where drums and listening to the world is of importance. The ear is primary like a cavern, such as listening to the birds and the drums, as its organization of the acoustic. And so the primary body organ, again, he has these different primary organs of each of these structures. And so within the actual body is one of the intestine. And each structure, the organs will, of course, change in their meaning. And so the magical consciousness of the head is emphasized on that acoustic ear, but the mythical of the mouth, think etymologically of the association of myth and mouth, is introduced, and the mental consciousness is one of the eye. With the body itself, the magical looks to the intestines within. The mythical moves up to the heart, and the rational is of the eye, as we see these shifts go up kind of gradually up the spine of the body in the head. Moving forward, you have from the ears and mouth to the eye, and then rationally put with the brain as a gradual way consciousness is evolving. And so, to reiterate, we're going from the whole view of archaic as one unity or ground of being, a womb of perfection, to the magical view of the proto or part of the whole. And so you have the creating of a manipulation, and so space and the timelessness of it stands as sort of one dimension up to the integral at the fourth level. And so the efficient mode, if Gebser here describes for us what the efficiency and deficiency is of each of these structures. So the efficient mode of the magical was of spell casting, and then you have the degradation, if you'd like. The deficient mode is of black magic or sorcery, and in this sense, you can kind of see how, as the efficiency really is democratized out, you then step into deficiency, where anyone can do black magic or sorcery. The spells really lose their meaning over time as more people have access to it. The mythical structure, in so far as when it's concerned with festivals and seasons, with the agrarian perspective, the cycle of the seasonality. And so, of course, you have the harvesting, winter, summer, spring, and these different cycles to be able to harvest the crops. This is the movement from the magical to the mythical, with the gain knowledge of experiencing time. So you're leaving the cavern-like closed universe that was spaceless and timeless, that never changes. The properties were always fixed and sort of ever-like, but something like seasonality, something like harvest, obviously you're introducing time in a sort of cyclical way. And so the mythical is polaristic in cycles and periods, and this is the gradual shift from one dimension to the two dimension. The magical is an awareness in one aspect of being put against nature, to the evolution of the mythical dualisms of the soul, and differentiates from the macro soul. So again, you're seeing that sort of polarity developing here. And so the different polarities, case in point with the Egyptian gods and the heavens separating itself from the world, which is the same with the differentiation of the soul from nature, and is more clearly cut from the background. Naturalism, all of the lone individual with less nature cling to him as art shifts to the mythical structure. So again, you're kind of shedding that background now as the ego is really evolving now through the individual. And so Gebser says no mouth in the magical means there is no myth, which someone like Joseph Campbell would say that's false, because of course there is plenty of accounts now of myth in the ancient world of hunters, but nonetheless the magical mentality is more correct, such as the depiction of the mouth. And so the ancestor gives way to the gods and harnesses creativity with its visionary myths. Myths are imagistic, whereas the magical was of pure emotion and primal urges. The mouth articulates the myth, and etymologically located to the mouth also relates to the mute of or silence in the ancient mysteries and remains wordless. And so interesting to point for Gebser, when he's really talking about that difference between myth and mouth, and the mute or the silence, and the remaining of wordless, he's pointing out that this was understood or at least experienced fully, where there was really no need to create a binary between the difference between the mute and the myth, if you would like, which is kind of hard to wrap your head around. But he tries to point out that the way that these things, of course, were understood in their own structures can be very different in their experiences, which I think is a very right observation to make. So again, Gebser points out that he thinks that the deficient mode is the speaking of these myths, and he might not be right about that one necessarily, or at least his observation. But I think if you do consider some of the things I've said, of course, with language and law and the written word over time, as if you're looking to record keep, if you're writing something down, such as the myth of the Sumerian myth of record keeping, to remember something, also is a sort of degradation in its act, because you're needing to remember something to write it down, and as such, if that's necessary, then you're kind of almost in a sort of deficient mode. Then rehash that. There's the no sense of everything spoken in A and not B, or the exclusion within the mythical structure, such as when we think of myth as uttering the word, but also the silence implied or mute, as etymologically mentioned above. So again, the polaristics in types, such as yin and yang, and the structure of the nature going from the point to the circle. And then he shifts really to the organs, such as the Greeks in consciousness was in the chest, the heart, and the moving from the ear to the mouth, and as well as emotional to the imagistic form. And this is the vision of the mythical conscious structure with high civilizations such as Egyptians and Mesopotamia, and survives to the Greeks. So he's kind of like pointing out how you could line up really how high civilizations, or these particular ones, show this sort of process, moving from the chest and moving from the ear to the mouth in the myth. So then we turn to the mental structure, which begins all the way back with the Greeks in 500 BC, but is ultimately rediscovered in late perspectivity with the Renaissance. Magical, of course, is pre-perspectival, as mentioned above, and perspectival discovers much later in northern Faustian European society. Mythical is unperspectival. It has a differentiation of time in a cycle, whereas space is not configured itself out of the background. The mental structure begins in the Iliad, the wrath of Achilles. The first word of the West is wrath, or Ennis, is related, of course, in etymology to measurement, to mentality, to mensuration, to moon, and thinking. And of course, the wrath is specific and directed. Athena and his protector, who is the goddess of wisdom, after Zeus devours her and is the patron of wisdom, she is the direct child of the goddess of intelligence, after all. So this is really the birth for Gebser of that mental structure, at least within the Greeks. Manu, the lawgiver, and the prefix of the mental construction, begins to flirt with space, such as geometrics to the point, to the circle, and now the triangle, and vertex. In perspectival painting, or in the intellectual history, we'd see the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. It's a triadic thought, where synthesis is that unified point, such as, again, the evolution to the triangular. The synthesis is a sort of point like where thesis and antithesis come together. And of course, you could think of rationality as such in the mental at the time. And then he has some interesting things to say of the Trinitarian in Christ, where Christianity, at least with Christ, is the first God who really resists, for Gebser, falling back into the mythical, where, of course, on the walking on water miracle, the water is the old symbol of the soul and resists falling into the former structures. Christianity and Moses is the hero of wrath, who gives a law and directs anger or wrath mentally to the sinners. So again, that directed wrath, it's not just emotional, it's very directed, it's mentally constructed. And so the Christianity, or the mental structure, is of the eye, and that pattern mutation of ear to mouth to eye of the head as the primary organ. The triangle cuts the circle, mythical mentality, whereas the triangle is a tool of logic and rationally cutting of the binding circle slash psyche. And so the logic brings in the tools to rip the mythical apart. And its consistencies with the Socratic man, as Nietzsche would point. which of course Nietzsche's critique with the Socratic man is that the myths are all being sterilized. And so the mental structure is introduced as a shift from polarities in the mythic structure to logically deduced dualisms. And so A cannot also be not A. Again, you can see that shift from before. And so you no longer have the yin and yang where the world complements the heavens in a polarity. Everything is now in this sort of triangular or a triad of synthesis pointing. Just as emotions within the magical and in the mythical, it was of the imagistic now, and then in the mental is of the abstract principles. The word menace is, of course, discursive and logic in its hallmark form as a tool to be used. However, in deficient mode, this simply becomes rationality as put. And so the beginning of that second mental phase in the Renaissance then shows that the deficient phase of pure rationality at about 1800. The Socratic man, just as for Spengler steps in, says we're, of course, going to the winter rationality, which sterilizes the spring and summer phase of the culture, sterilizes the gods and the myths. However, despite this, and being in the mental structure, at least living after it in the aperspectival, all of these structures, of course, as mentioned with the principles of the archaic, all the structures remain within us because, of course, they mutated. And so even though there's, efficiencies and deficiencies and a sort of domination of a structure at a given time, all structures nonetheless are still ever present, and we kind of slip in and out of them at any given time. Of course, we become very tribal very quickly. We become ideologues very quickly. For Gebser, this is, again, shifting and going to these different ever-present ways in which our consciousness is awakened. And so the part of modernity for Gebser from 1880 onward is of the integrating, that any structure can be inhabited within us, where and when they are activated or used to be seen in your own perspectivity that operate, I think, of course, as I've mentioned before, similar to how Heidegger in the posits to truth as aletheia, where, as you're uncovering stones along the clearing of truth, you're positing questions. And so the same could be said, I think, of how, we have all of these structures within us, and, where we give ourselves to is of utmost importance when you're in the aperspectival time of course, the maturation of the individual ego. But I think this is a good stopping point as we're about halfway through the ever-present origin now, and I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I look forward to finishing this text with you guys.